Okay, good evening. We are up to our third installment of our Exploring Religious Zionism lecture series. Tonight, we hope to cover political Zionism, cultural Zionism, and religious Zionism. Obviously, there's a lot to cover, but we will try to focus on a number of key figures: Herzl, Achad Ha'am, maybe a little bit of Chaim Weizmann, and Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines as the founder of Mizrahi, and we will try to discuss the idea of the birth of the movement that Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines founded, religious. We could call it the beginnings of religious Zionism. So let's begin in an interesting place. I'd like to start with an article written by Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was an American contemporary scholar. He's most associated with the University of Chicago, where he's taught there for many years. He authored books and works on Spinoza, Hobbes, Rambam, Maimonides, and Al-Farabi. So it's a very interesting place to start, but I think his introduction to the translation of Spinoza's Critique of Religion, I think paints a really, really important picture that I would like to almost encapsulates, I want to incorporate it into our entire lecture or shiur tonight. So Strauss writes as follows. This is source number one. Strictly political Zionism became effective only through becoming an ingredient, not to say the backbone of Zionism at large. So, as we'll see, these are a little bit like all terminology in this type of movement, which is fluid and things are happening sort of, and developing in real time. So some of these titles like political Zionism, we'll see, cultural Zionism, like that's not necessarily the terminology that was used at the time. It's not like they formed these camps and then those camps had certain perspectives. It sort of happened around individuals, around ideas, and around, we'll see, the disparities between the different groups and the cultural differences between the different groups of Zionists. But let's just use this terminology, which has been sort of established as political Zionism, as we'll see, has a lot to do with Herzl and what he was trying to accomplish. However, so it set out to solve the Jewish problem, but in establishing a state. But according to Strauss, it did not solve the Jewish problem, and it could not solve the Jewish problem because of the narrowness of its original conception, however noble. This narrowness was pointed out most effectively by cultural Zionism. So we'll see one of the main leaders of this movement, which again, it didn't necessarily have a name and a group formally, but it developed around certain individuals and with a certain way of thinking around Achad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, as we'll see. So this lack of its ability to solve the Jewish problem, strictly political Zionism, was pointed most effectively out by cultural Zionism. It lacked a historical perspective. It was only formed with an emergency and resolve. And he writes just, I think, very succinctly but eloquently that steps had to be taken in order to establish a Jewish state. But the foundation, the Jewish heritage itself, was not the product of human efforts, but it was a divine gift, a divine revelation. That was what cultural Zionism pointed out, were the lackings of political Zionism. Now, he writes a question here, which I think we're going to again deal with, which is very significant debate between the political Zionists and the cultural Zionists. Did one not completely distort the meaning of the heritage to which one claimed to be loyal by interpreting it as a culture like any other high culture? In other words, what is Zionism? Is it every country has a culture? We saw the sort of writings like this in Sfirot Kalisher. Every country has a national fervor, a certain pride in their culture. So Cultural Zionism believed itself to have found a safe middle ground between politics and divine revelation. Right? Political Zionism was to solve the Jewish problem. According to Strauss, it could not do that because it was only there to serve as a measure to get a Jewish state to solve the Jewish problem is so much larger. There is the whole source of the Jewish heritage, but it also believed that it was in the right space between divine revelation and power politics. However, as we'll see, I think this is also very astute. It lacked the sternness of the two extremes. What exactly was it? It wasn't the old school, as we'll soon see. Cultural Zionism was not a return back to the shtetl. It was embracing a new reality, a new vision of Jewish life, a new state. But it was denying the validity of purely political Zionism. So it was less, I think his words are very well chosen, less stern, it was less forceful, less clear, less definitive than the two extremes. Now this is, I think, also very, very important formulation here. I think he's 100% correct. When cultural Zionism understands itself, it turns into religious Zionism. But when religious Zionism understands itself, it is in the first place Jewish faith and only secondarily Zionism. So cultural Zionism is opposed to purely political Zionism. But then it sort of merges or evolves. It's not just the forming of a Jewish state. Now what's the state about? Who are we? What are we? And the thing is, if you fully take it to the next step, it becomes religious Zionism. But then religious Zionism has to establish itself as we're formally religious. We're a people even without a state. We're a people. We believe in Torah. We believe in divine revelation. So then it's only secondarily Zionism. So that's sort of the progression. He writes, the establishment of the state of Israel is the most profound modification of the galut, or the galus, the exile which has occurred. But it is not the end of the galut in the religious sense, or perhaps not only in the religious sense. The state of Israel is part of the galut, part of the galus, part of the exile. Fascinating. And I think these words, if we were to summarize what Strauss was saying, is that political Zionism leads to cultural Zionism, which then leads to religious Zionism, which, as we said before, is religious before it is Zionism. So what is Zionism? So I think that I want to sort of approach this question with this the topic with this meta question in mind. We won't necessarily solve it, but I think all these debates and we'll see the conceptions of Herzl and his vision, and then Achad Ha'am's vision, and then we'll see later the religious Zionist vision. All of these visions have a lot to do with the needs and the reality on the ground. However, they will have echoes of this debate and of these disagreements, even like there will be echoes of this throughout the whole century and leading us really into the present day. So let's begin with Herzl. Herzl was born in 1860, passed away very young at the age of 44 in 1904, suddenly. It was only really on the scene for about 8 or 9 years, which is incredible, what he was able to accomplish in that small span of life and of active political Zionism. He was, I really think, somewhat of a tragic figure, as we'll soon see, but he created huge changes at the geopolitical level, and we're still seeing the ripple effect of what he was able to accomplish. And he is known by most historians to be the father of modern political Zionism. He died young, as I mentioned. Almost all the Herzls died young. He was born in Pest, or Pest. Later it was renamed Budapest when it became joined.
Besides the river.
Yeah, I think so, right?
Yeah, Buda and Pest.
Yeah. He then later his family moved to Vienna, and they were a very wealthy, prominent family. He was a very assimilated Jew. He did not even have a bar mitzvah, and refused to give his son a circumcision. So that's the context in which he starts to, we'll see what changes, but that's the context of Herzl's upbringing. First, he goes into law. He doesn't feel satisfied by that. He becomes a journalist and a playwright. And then, you may not be familiar with this, but we'll just go through this a little bit generally. Something happens in his life that completely shifts his perspective, and that is known as the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair in 1895 was to forever change Herzl's perspective on life. So, what is the Dreyfus Affair? So really, at the beginning, we have to start with the French Revolution. The French Revolution, 1789 through 1799, was tremendous global upheaval. The world saw this as a harbinger of tremendous change. There was sudden emancipation of the Jewish people. However, almost 100 years after the French Revolution, which you'd think the world is moving towards progression, we're now looking towards equality, the Dreyfus Affair shows that the whole thing basically implodes, at least from Herzl's perspective. So who was Dreyfus? So Alfred Dreyfus, living in France, you can see a picture of him I have on your source sheet. He was tried for treason in France for communicating French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris.
He was a captain in the French army.
Yes, a captain in the French army, and he was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment and sent overseas to be just kept for his entire life. And eventually he was exonerated, but only pardoned 100 years later. Now, at the time that this was happening, Herzl was a journalist, and he was covering the story. In fact, interestingly, Herzl believed Dreyfus was guilty. But that wasn't what really irked him, and that's not what really caused him to basically shift his entire focus of his career. He was overwhelmed by the rancor and the energy, the resurgence of anti-Semitism that he saw surrounding the case. He could not believe that they didn't see this person who, Alfred Dreyfus, spoiler alert, he was Jewish. He didn't believe that they would associate him as being a Jew. He would say, okay, they see him as a traitor. He's an individual traitor. He's a bad person, whatever. Whether he was guilty at the time, he thought for sure he was guilty. He trusted the judicial system. Remember, Herzl grows up in this prominent, wealthy, established family. So they follow the rules. They are, they're in the in crowd. They're part of the establishment. So that was totally understandable that he would take the party line. But what was fascinating is that what happened changed his entire perspective. I have a little clipping of a story that Herzl wrote. I believe it's obviously in translation. But he looked around at this crowd, and they're saying, "Death to the Jews!" Right? This is a little snippet here. He reached a line of officers who roared at him, "Judas," or I guess Judas, "traitor!" Dreyfus shouted in their direction, "I forbid you to sully my honor." When he reached a group of journalists, he halted and said, "You must tell all of France that I am innocent." And some replied by vilifying the mob, outshouted from time to time, "Death to the traitor." And not only did they say death to the traitor, but it was the cheers in the crowd that Herzl, couldn't foresee and could not forget, was that they emerged together with death to the Jews. And he made basically a 180-degree turn in his mentality. And he came to the conclusion that anti-Semitism was a permanent reality. And the Jew, as his own family had attempted to reach equal status, would not be able to unless there would be a Jewish state. So this is sort of his vision that he writes out in his most well-known work is Der Judenstaat. Der Judenstaat means the Jewish state. And he says that we've tried to be loyal patriots. We made the sacrifices that are necessary as our loyal citizens, but we are denounced as strangers in the countries in which we have lived for centuries. And this experience changed Herzl. It changed his perspective, which I think a few things to learn from this, but like a lot of people, they see things and they think they're powerless. And he was very talented, and we'll see he was able to make a tremendous amount of change. But he was just a journalist working for some small paper, and he sees this going on, and and he decides to take action. So he writes Der Judenstaat about a year later, and he lays out his solution for the Jewish problem. And his solution would be that anti-Semitism is not going away. We need our own state. We need it to be a response. It's primarily a response to anti-Semitism. It will be a refuge for the Jews. It would be a secular, democratic state, not as the messianic, embodiment of the messianic era, as we talked about, Rav Kalisher. It would be a state like their, like the state that they know, that we'll see how he paints the picture in some of his work. We'll talk about it more generally, but it's certainly not a messianic vision. He was a very charismatic political leader, and he worked basically frantically for the last 8 to 9 years of his life, going around meeting with politicians, putting together, as we'll soon see, congresses, meetings. He was very stately. His stature, he had his booming voice, as you saw, his stately beard, and he had just charmed his way into the halls of power, with very little, buy-in. He did come from this prominent family, but it was just somehow he just got his way into the political scene. So it's really, really a fascinating story. You can see here a picture where he's meeting with Kaiser Wilhelm II. He has his hat in his hand there, and you see the famous picture, which I know Jerry showed me, that they have these renditions. If you go to Basel in Switzerland, they have like these different events that you can go to as the World Zionist Congress, and you could go to the actual balcony where his picture was taken. You could stay in the room, and so this is the famous picture. Now he had this vision that, he's going to go to politicians and get them to support the Jewish state, and if he got Germany on his side, which is why he wanted to meet with the Kaiser, then all the other countries would follow suit. The problem was that Germany did not own Palestine at the time. It was owned by the Ottoman Empire, and the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, Ahmad Mukhtar Pasha, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, was not at all interested in meeting with Herzl. He didn't really feel so kindly to Christian countries coming to him and telling him what he should do. There were other people. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he was very charmed by Herzl, and he did meet with him, and he gave him a beautiful diamond pin, but he didn't really take Herzl very seriously. Now, at this time, as we mentioned before, things were moving forward. Chovevei Tzion was now a full formal movement. There was so much upswelling and interest in Zionism, even though Herzl was clearly not the first Zionist, but things were just aligning in the right time, and things were moving, and he was able to, accomplish a tremendous amount, just to getting people together. So, I think one of the most, during his lifetime, one of the most significant accomplishments was the Basel World Zionist Congress in 1897. So some of the Chaver here is more knowledgeable about this than I am, who actually went to Basel, and they told them that why was it not in Germany? Many of the delegates and many of the Zionists came from Germany because the German Jews were afraid of doing it or uncomfortable with doing it in Germany. So they did it down the road, and not down the road, but close by in Switzerland. So what was a great accomplishment was, first of all, it happened, 1897. Many different types of Jews across the spectrum came for a number of days to discuss the different issues in the Zionist movement. And I want to get back to some of the Jews that came that disagreed with Herzl's vision. But before we do that, I want to talk about one of the most controversial proposals that was made later. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's important. We're just getting a broad strokes here. So in 1903, the World Zionist Congress, I believe this was the third one. The Sixth Zionist Congress. The Sixth Zionist Congress happened in 1903, and this was when Herzl makes his famous Uganda proposal. So before we start with the Uganda proposal, which will help us lead us into the debate between cultural Zionism and political Zionism, as we mentioned before, we have to understand what happened in 1903. The other major Jewish event that happened in 1903 was the Kishinev massacre. You can see pictures of the Kishinev massacre in 1903 against the Jews of living in the Russian Empire, and it was an anti-Jewish riot that took place in Kishinev, and it was terrible. It began on Easter Day. 49 Jews were killed, 92 were gravely injured, 1,500 homes were damaged, women were raped. It was a terrible, terrible pogrom. And, we've had pogroms. Unfortunately, we've even seen in modern times, we've had recent times pogroms. So what was different about this? This is like what they say, nothing to write home about. The thing is, there was to write home about because there were mass media. Media now today is a different world than it was then. But then there actually were newspapers that circulated. And this made the papers. And the world saw the Kishinev massacre. And Herzl felt the time had come that we need a solution now. Not, okay, we're going to get together, we're going to talk about a Jewish state, we're going to write up speeches, we're going to inspire people for a few days in Switzerland, and then that's it. What happens next? Herzl said, no, we need a solution now. He didn't get, as we mentioned before, he didn't get the responses he was hoping for in the Ottoman Empire. So what would be the solution? So without getting into all the details of why Uganda was picked, but he met with a number of British government officials, and at the time, the British were in charge of East Africa, and he had, obviously worked through a number of the steps that this would require. But he made this famous proposal in Basel in 1903 that the Jewish people should move to Uganda. We would form a Jewish state, and it would be under the British colony, and that would be the Jewish solution. Again, remember, Herzl does not come from religious perspective. He does not come from a messianic vision. He says the Jews need a solution to anti-Semitism. We need a refuge. So wherever that has to be, if right now the Jewish state's not working, Israel's not working, or Palestine is not available, so we'll go to Uganda.
Were there people living there? I guess they were natives.
So this is the question that many scholars wonder, even in the Jewish state. Like, what were the Zionists thinking? There was an Arab population. It wasn't as large as it is today, but this is a question. Even Uganda, I don't know the details of Uganda. I guess they had they had room, but the general question, which even fascinating, Achad Ha'am did think about this. He did think about this. We'll talk about that. What did they think was going to happen? Yeah. You just bring all these millions of Jews or hundreds of thousands of Jews, and the Arabs are just going to be Europe. All right, it's fine with us. Whether it's our ancestral land or whether it's not, but just on a pragmatic level, what was the plan? There's a fascinating question which historians are talking about today. As we understand, there's this, obviously this major conflict. To say it very, very generally, it was not thought of adequately. But it was definitely, some mentioned it. Achad Ha'am, as we'll see. I'll just tell you. Achad Ha'am did not believe everyone... we'll get into it. Yeah. He didn't believe everyone had to move to Israel. His belief was that the Jewish state would be sort of the heart of the nation. We would create schools, we would create a new Hebrew culture, and people would go back to their countries. He did want to form a Jewish state, but it did not. He felt it was not enough room to accommodate all the Jews, and many Jews would go, but his vision was many Jews would remain in Chutz La'aretz, outside. Well, we don't. It seems to be, again, it's not 100% clear, but it seems to be that many of the Zionists believe that really like all the Jews or mass immigration would be the way that they would achieve a state. And Achad was cynical and had a different vision. But he was not as much of a politician. So we'll see. So what happens? They like every good Jewish machlokas, every debate. So they took a vote. They had many delegates. They took a vote. So what do you think happened? Maybe you already know. What do you think happened, Paul? The Uganda proposal. You think it went?
I guess it was voted down.
It was 100% passed.
Oh, passed.
295 delegates in favor, 178 against. The motion passed. However, the Russian and Eastern European Zionists, which we were mentioning before the shir, someone said that they think that the congresses were held in German, even though there were many different countries and representatives of different countries. The largest minority of delegates came from Eastern European countries, Russia, Poland, and they would have nothing of it. They walked out. They were so disgusted. There are different versions of different stories, but there's a story about a woman who, as Herzl's walking out, she said, you traitor, people felt that this was
because of this proposal that wasn't his.
This proposal that passed, he didn't understand it. What did I not? From Herzl's perspective, the Eastern European Jews were suffering the most. The Russians were the ones who died in the Kishinev massacre, and he's giving them a solution. He's handing it to them, and they're throwing it in his face, and he didn't get it. And we'll see that this is part of, I think, what Herzl didn't understand about the Eastern European Zionists, and the Eastern European Zionists didn't appreciate where he was coming from. It really had a lot to do with what we said before, his background, his perspective, the country in which he grew up in, his vision of a Jewish state, which we'll see soon. But that was...
it's also just there's a total difference between Western European Jews.
Yes.
The element, the influence of the Haskalah, they're much more assimilated, much more
Right.
sophisticated. They're not...
Right.
And the Eastern ones are typically...
More traditional.
Yes. More religious.
Yes.
Don't have... So it's night and day.
Correct.
And so it's not surprising that you would have this kind of gulf.
It may be ideological, but it also may be cultural. And this is what Jerry said last time, that there was this difference in how even the Litvische Rabbanim, the Lithuanian rabbis, how they approached trying to hold everyone together, like the Netziv and Rav Tzvi Ershkalisher, and how, let's say, the Hungarians were, more willing to, isolate and separate. So it's a very interesting point. But I think you're onto it. This basically, it passed, but this large minority of the Russian Zionists, they rebelled. They just couldn't envision a Jewish state not in our ancestral homeland. Really, they walked out. Basically, they walked out and they protested. And in 1904, Herzl dies at 44. The whole thing is shelved primarily because not only did Herzl die, but what happens? World War I breaks out, shortly after that. And the whole thing pretty much in those years, in those decades, becomes shelved. Now, it's fascinating. In 1901, I wanted to just read you one last quote from Herzl, and then we'll move on to Achad Ha'am. He writes something which, again, it's just his almost prophetic. I don't want to say he was a prophet, but we'll see. Rav Kook in next class talks about him as potentially a iteration of or some form of the Mashiach ben Yosef, as we mentioned in the first class about the Vilna Gaon's messianism. So I'm not going to call him a prophet, but it was incredibly prophetic what he wrote in his diary in 1901. He writes as follows: "One day, once the Jewish state comes into existence, all this will appear petty and unremarkable. Perhaps a fair-minded historian will find that it was a something after all." Okay, I don't know. This I don't know if it made it onto your sheet. It may not have.
Yeah,
It's on the sheet?
Page 5.
So help me out with this word. When an impecunious Jewish journalist, in the midst of the deepest degradation of the Jewish people, and at the time of the most disgusting anti-Semitism, made a flag out of a rag and turned a miserable rabble into a people rallying around that flag. So he basically predicts the fact that there will be a Jewish state. It will come about in the time of the most difficult and disgusting anti-Semitism, but it will happen, and somehow all this he's sort of not articulating it completely, but he's referencing the fact that all these debates within the Zionist movement, and he said it's all going to appear petty. Like, we got the Jewish state, we did it, and they made the flag out of a rag.
He predicted that within 50 years.
Yes.
Even
Wrote within 50 years.
Yes. Very interesting, very fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe we would call today, as I mentioned, these terminologies didn't really exist back then, but they're sort of superimposed, looking backwards. Political Zionism, sort of, that was the birth of political Zionism, and eventually the success of political Zionism was the founding of the Jewish state, or maybe one would argue even the end of political Zionism, because once the state is founded, there is no purpose for political Zionism any longer. But that, again, that's a different discussion. So let's get ourselves acquainted with another figure that I think is a helpful foil, and also we'll gain a better appreciation of the cultural clash we mentioned before that so much was characterized the debate around the Uganda proposal, and that is both the figure Asher Ginsburg, or better known as Achad Ha'am, and the cultural Zionist movement. So Achad Ha'am was, he had really an incredible, ability to his pithy and insightful essays. He was really a self-taught scholar, somewhat of a recluse, and he had a small circle of elite Hebraists that followed him. We'll see that Chaim Weizmann was a student of his, or a colleague of his, and he had a completely different vision of the Jewish state. And I think, in contrast to Herzl's political Zionism, as we mentioned, Achad Ha'am's plan was really to emphasize education and culture. And he criticized political Zionism as really naive, immature. It wasn't going to solve the general picture, the general Jewish problem. As we mentioned before, he acknowledged the fact that there were Arabs living in the land it was owned by the Ottoman Palestine at the time, and he didn't think that most Jews would immigrate to the land of Israel. He thought most Jews would actually immigrate to North America. But his vision was that Judaism needs to be transformed. We need to rethink Judaism. You can see a few pictures here. As I mentioned before, I was going to give you a little bit of a taste of Herzl and his debate with Achad Ha'am. So, just to give a general, again, this is all just touching on the ideas. There's a lot more to say, but in the work that Herzl wrote, Alt New Land, which I think I'm pronouncing that somewhat okay, the Old New Land, which was his vision of the utopian state. Herzl, he basically pictures a decrepit and barren swampland that turns into this modern city abundant with theaters and schools and cosmopolitans, and it's basically like a new Vienna in the Holy Land, or I don't even know if he called it the Holy Land. And Achad Ha'am, that's really what got him, and he launches into many, many critiques, emphasizing the neglect of anything Jewish about Herzl's vision. So, if you see, Hillel Halkin actually has a great article about this debate, what Achad Ha'am saw and Herzl missed, and vice versa. And he really paints this picture of, the Easterners, for the most part, they were totally won over by Herzl's presence. He was tall and handsome. He had this charm about him, a grace, 2 dark eyes burning like coals that lend majesty to his mild and pleasant mien. This is source number 2. Even the Easterners were swept away. Yeah,
because I thought we said before.
Yes.
Didn't really
that was before. Meaning, this is like in the beginning of the whole story. And I think even there was a certain respect they had for him, even though they walked out when it came to the Uganda proposal.
And the anti-Semitism was so...
Yes, but the point is, and that Hil Halkin makes, is even the Easterners who were taken by him, Achad Ha'am was not. Achad Ha'am, he said when
Where
he
was
left,
from originally?
he grew up in, I don't know where he grew up. I mean, Eastern Europe.
Oh, that's-
Yeah, like a traditional upbringing, like a Jewish religious
But he
upbringing.
wasn't observant.
I don't know. I don't believe so. But he was definitely much more, Jewishly literate. Like he
Right.
was very. He writes about the prophets, and he quotes Gemaras, and he has different ideas. This is part of the question of when we get to religious Zionism. Was he more dangerous or was Herzl more dangerous? We'll see from a religious perspective. So he said when he left Basel. I think he was living in Odessa. I don't know if he grew up in Odessa, but when he left Basel, he said, "I felt like a mourner at a wedding. Everyone's celebrating, and he's in mourning." And he's until Alt Neuland was published, he sort of kept this to himself. But once the utopian vision that Herzl writes out was published, he comes out, guns blazing against this vision. What were the issues he had? So, first of all, Alt Neuland, which Herzl wrote in 1902, it has like a whole prologue, and it has like a vision where you have these different, they're fictional characters, but they come, they sail by their yachts back and forth between this new country and Europe, and they were 2 decades in this island, and they come back to Europe, and they want to see what has happened in Europe since their absence. And they go through the Suez Canal, and they decide. So I'm sorry, they weren't going back and forth there, but on their trip back to Europe, they decide to go. This is 20 years after this book was written, so it's a futuristic picture. They decide, let's go visit Palestine and see what has happened. And to their amazement, it's been transformed, and these cities are, have these roads, and the green fields worked by tractors, and the swamps have been turned into, real cities, and trains and automobiles whiz across, and it's just like exciting, Thank you. Achad Ha'am was born in Skvira, near Kiev. Thank
According
you.
to Rabbi Google.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's good
Thank
enough.
you. Ukraine.
I can trust Google for place of birth.
So, so he has this vision in Alt Neuland of like this cosmopolitan, metropolitan type of country, and he writes basically Palestine would be a country that other Europeans would be envious of, and Achad Ha'am takes him to task, and he says, "Here's a nice selection. I put some different selections of his writings. He wrote a lot, and he has a lot to say. So I will try to go through them somewhat briefly. But here it's interesting. He's criticizing Geiger, so he's positioning himself in between these two. There's the reformers, but he's also he's not a reformer, but he's also very critical of Herzl's vision, and he very much is a believer in Hebrew culture, and he says Geiger, he's expressed that really any writer who's writing in Hebrew at the present day does not express his own inner spirit, but lives for the time being in another world, the world of the Talmud, the rabbis, and adopts their mode of thinking. So that was what Geiger said. You're writing in Hebrew, you have no relevance to us today. You're living in the past. And Achad Ha'am, the reason why I bring this up is you see sort of Achad Ha'am's vision. He says absolutely not. He says the opposite is the case. He says the Hebrew writers of Northern Europe and Palestine, for whom Hebrew is still a part of their being, the case is just the reverse. When they write, the necessity of writing Hebrew springs from their innermost being. And he's critical of Geiger, and he has his own theory as to what it is. But you see that he has this sort of this organic or natural vision of how Hebrew culture will come out of the Jewish soul, and it's almost like it has this religious feel, and yet he's not traditional. We'll see. He has his own vision. But he thinks it all has a lot to do with Hebrew and Hebrew culture, and he really one of the first Hebrew writers who writes. We have in translation here, Hebrew writer is a profound writer. One of the first was Achad Ha'am. Now he writes in a few places, not naming Herzl, but I believe that it's very clear he's talking about Herzl. And this essay called "A New Savior," he writes about what Herzl publishes as in a French Jewish newspaper, the internal emancipation of Judaism. So here he writes that, Herzl, he doesn't name him, but he quotes this Jewish writer who wrote that, us Western Jews, we need to help our Eastern brethren and help them from their inner slavery. And he says that, this is definitely sarcastic and, as I mentioned, somewhat pithy, our distinguished friend who goes to the trouble of writing his second and third article, basically, telling people, you have to feel bad for them. How can you just all of a sudden hope that the Jews of Russia and Romania will be brought into an atmosphere of philosophy and science like ours in the West? It is heartless then to expect them to emancipate themselves. We must assist them. So this is Achad Ha'am paraphrasing Herzl. Assist them. This is now his hymn speaking. But how and wherewith? The answer is very simple. The emancipated Western Jews are to put into our hands the weapon which we lack, rational criticism. And he says this is just a powerful weapon, and why don't we? So then he says, so why don't we follow this? Such a logical thing. We should use our rational minds. And why are the Eastern Jews so backwards? So he says, why do we not follow the example of the Western Jews? Why should we not be content to be the Jews of their type? And he says, just very, very strongly, he says, you're telling us we need to be emancipated? We have enslaved ourselves? He says, you need to emancipate yourself. But you cannot. It is not in you to emancipate yourself. It is heartless to expect you to emancipate yourselves. Like he's flipping it on its head. You think we're the ones who are lost? You're lost. That is a task beyond your moral strength. It is not you, but we, the quote-unquote poor who believe in the East, who will emancipate you from that inner slavery in which all unconscious you are sunk. We will fill your spiritual emptiness with Jewish feeling. We will bring you Judaism, not the fair-sounding, meaningless lip phrase, which is your confession of faith, but a living Judaism of the heart, inspired with the will and the power to develop and to renew its strength. And then you will change your tune about slavery and emancipation. So Herzl's saying, we feel so bad for these backwards, old-school Jews who, they don't really know what a real cultural existence would be. And Achad Ha'am is saying, we will bring Judaism to what you...
He doesn't mean Judaism, he means Jewish culture.
Jewish culture, right, Jewish culture. But what he's saying is Judaism, what's coming from your heart and the organic, natural Judaism. And he says, every true lover of Zionism will realize, this is source number 6, that it must realize the danger which it incurs through the diffusion of the idea that it has no concern with anything except diplomacy and financial transactions. Right? There's no real, as he said before, there's no real cultural, organic faith that is being built. I see the hour is getting late, and we haven't even got to religious Zionism. Mm-hmm. So let me skip ahead a little bit. I'll just tell you briefly, he paints a picture that over the generations and even going back to the first temple, the second temple. So Achad Ha'am paints the picture of there were those who were ascetics and didn't want any involvement in this world, and then there were those who embraced political materialism, and then there were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were sort of this middle road, and he sees that the Pharisees were this combination of flesh and spirit. And he said the political materialists, after Churban Abayis, after the destruction of the temple, they ceased to exist. The Pharisees became rabbinic Judaism. They were able to succeed even after the Churban. And he says that this is because they were a combination. They recognized the need for political activism, which was the rabbis were involved in the political state, but it was not the end-all and be-all. So it's a very interesting perspective. Okay, so Herzl paints this picture of this new cosmopolitan metropolis as, the Jewish state. Achad Ha'am says, you have all these wonderful things, new society, institutions. He says, but there's nothing Jewish about it. There's nothing about it that is Hebrew. The newspapers are all going to be, completely bereft of any Jewish content. And he says, you have this big vision and you think we're going to emancipate us. We're going to emancipate you from your, Western, non-Jewish, basically, perspective. Okay. Just if you want to get a sense of...
Funny that Herzl could continue to embrace assimilation, and yet he felt anti-Semitism was high risk.
So I don't know if he was... the thing is, he grew up in an assimilated culture. I think he was breaking from that in a sense, but he didn't... First of all, just to put it in perspective, he didn't grow up with the same upbringing. He didn't have the natural... what Achad Ha'am describes,
right.
Sort of this inborn, one of the great Zionists, Max Norder. So this is Weitzman, who I told you before Weitzman was one of the colleagues of Achad Ha'am. He says Max Norder is a great Zionist once a year. Once a year at the Congress, he gives a big speech. He says, "But we sit and we hope for Zion every Motzei Shabbos, every Saturday night, and this was the debate." So I'm sort of summarizing this, but just to show you that Achad Ha'am was not saying we should return back to the traditional Jew. He writes, and if you look at source number 10, he writes about his vision of a new Jew. He calls him in translation the enlightened Jew, or Yehudi Maskil. The Yehudi Maskil, she is achtu berucho yesod ha'lumi ha'evri, the Jew, this new Jew whose spirit combines the elements of Hebrew nationalism. Ima yesod anoshi ha'klali, achdud muchletet v'hayu litzur echad shalem. He combines it with this idea of general humanism. He is whole, without bli nigudim pnimiyim, without internal contradictions. And he says he doesn't have this kara balev, he doesn't have this rending of the heart, which he thinks that the Jews, the current Jew doesn't have a solution to this. They want to be part of the world, but they can't. So his vision is the new Jew is able to have a new culture. A new Jew has to be born. A new cultural Zionism is the answer to this. And you can see he goes back and forth. He talks about in his writings, he has a famous, there's a famous article about Moshe Rabbeinu. He talks about how he feels when he opens up the Haggadah and Moshe Rabbeinu just comes in, and he has this traditional, almost natural, emotional connection to his Judaism, and yet he it can't be just a traditional perspective. It has to be new. It has to be meeting the moment, and a new Jew has to be born. So there's this unsurety, and it's not 100% clear what he wants and what he's building, but he definitely does not believe in Herzl's vision. And he believed, as we mentioned, that Israel would become the educational center, and the culture would have to be revived. And he said, Herzl's moving too fast. We haven't yet even gotten to a new culture where you're just jumping into the Jewish state with no heart, with no soul, with no vision. If anything, it's a vision of just another country. It's not the Jewish, not the Judaism, the new Jew that we need. Which brings us to I would say, another aspect, another perspective is the birth of religious Zionism, which we'll touch on now. So really, religious Zionism, is born in the context of the Chovevei Tzion movement begins to gain traction. But Achad Ha'am actually takes over. We mentioned before Leon Pinsker, he was the head of the Chovevei Tzion, and eventually Achad Ha'am becomes a leader. And that's when the opposition to Chovevei Tzion really, the opposition becomes more matured and more formidable. And many were against joining the Chovevei Tzion. Rav Shalom Ber, the Rebbe Rashab, was the one who organized much of the opposition. famously Rav Yaakov Lifshitz and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, and many, many traditional Jews. Once Achad Ha'am was the face of this movement, it was very clear. This was not just a refuge from anti-Semitism. Zionism was, for them, was a new vision of Judaism. It was not, right? It was counter to their traditional vision. We mentioned him last time, but Rav Shmuel Malver, who was intimately involved in the founding of religious Zionism, he himself had second thoughts about Achad Ha'am. And both he and Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines decided to side with Herzl. To side with the man who was an assimilated Jew, whose vision of the Jewish people was completely, the Jewish state was completely secular. But think about it, from their perspective, Herzl was not challenging their perspective of, or their vision of Judaism. Okay, he'll help us gain political refuge. He'll help us, maneuver in the political scheme. But he's safer, in a sense, than what Achad Ha'am is promoting. And therefore, Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, who is the founder of the religious Zionist movement, or generally known to be the founder of Mizrahi, Merkaz Ruchani, it's a acronym for that, or some sort of shorthand for that, he supported the Uganda proposal. Whoa! You could think, well, how could a religious thinker who was one of the first and most major, rabbinic figures to join the Zionist Congress, how could he support Herzl's Uganda proposal? How does that fit with what you'd imagine a religious person would, or a religious figure would? But you have to understand, Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines was not the messianist vision of what we would now say term religious Zionism. His religious Zionism was much more practical. It was a practical vision. We need to find a solution to the anti-Semitism. He promotes an idea of return to the state, to return to the land. He's believes that it is Merkaz Ruchani, it is the center, it is a spiritual center. But his focus was much more pragmatic. And therefore, if we need to be in Uganda temporarily,
it's a stepping stone.
The problem is as such. We have the Jews of Eastern Europe are being oppressed. The situation is not tenable. The Jews who are immigrating to America, in his view, and it was reality, were almost all assimilating. So we have this opportunity now to move to the land of Israel. Let's do it. Okay, that's not working out. Let's go to Uganda temporarily. So it was not, Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines was not what we would, we think today, like religious Zionism is this, we'll talk about it, but it really starts with Rav Kook, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and this new, messianic vision. But you look in the writings of Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, it's not about messianism per se. It's much more practical. You can see just a few citations I have over here. So he was responding to many. Just to give a little bit of a background, I know I'm going fast, but he was born in 1839, passes away in 1915. He was a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva. Many of the Zionists, as we mentioned, started in Volozhin. A tremendous Talmud Chacham, a tremendous Torah scholar, and many people were critical of the Zionist movement and of its secular leadership, and they said, "How can you join together with forces with secular Jews?" And this was the same criticism they had of the Netziv, and the Netziv wrote those letters. And Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, he says that what other people, just to look at some of his, I have here of a citation. This is a translation of his speech to the Zionist Congress called "The Finger of God," and he writes, "All that others see as detrimental, I view as a positive influence. Others see in the many Zionist parties divisions of the hearts, and I see it as unification of powers. If one party were to work for the coming of the redemption, this would not be surprising. But the fact that many different factions, each retaining its own specific view and ideology, can unite under one general flag, the national flag, this can only be seen as the finger of God." So he definitely, you see, he is talking about bringing redemption. I don't mean to say that he's not. But I should say more accurately, his vision was much more pragmatic. It's a step towards it. What's the step? We need to solve the Jewish the problem of the Jewish people being, persecuted, and nationalism is important. We can use nationalism. We can find, if the Uganda plan needs to be supported, we need to find a solution. So that's why, interestingly, right, Rabbi Yitzchak of Rhinus, who was a religious person who, was the brunt of many attacks. He actually had to close his yeshiva temporarily because there were so many people who were opposed to it. And his yeshiva promoted the idea of there was also secular studies and Torah, and people didn't want him to do it to found his yeshiva. But he took much criticism. But we can understand why he would embrace the Uganda proposal and Herzl's perspective, because from his perspective, it was less of a challenge to the traditional Jewish vision, and it was more pragmatic.
And it wasn't creating a new Judaism.
It wasn't creating a new Judaism, and so there. That's why he supported it. It was eventually. You want to catch the Marv, so we'll hold it over here. But what we'll try to cover next time is Rav Kook and his vision. And as you see, I just included it on your source sheet. You can take a look. Chaim Weizmann, who ends up being the first president of Israel, so he was definitely of the cultural Zionist world, but he just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and he gets the Balfour Declaration to be signed. That's a fascinating story in and of itself, but I don't think we have time for it at the moment. But going back, I guess, to finish the circle, to go back to Strauss's original point. Political Zionism was a temporary initiative. If it really to be clearly understood, there has to be some culture, some Jewish vision, some, like Acharam said, some natural, inborn passion or culture that the Jews have. But Strauss said, if you really want to understand that, if cultural Zionism really understands itself not just as a critique of political Zionism, but understands it to be, sort of owning the Jewish vision, that really turns itself into religious Zionism, which, as we saw, Rav Reines and Shmuel Oliver, they had a vision, but it was much more pragmatic. So things change. Yeah, so the flesh and the spirit, that's what in one place Achad Ha'am says, the flesh and the spirit of some sort of, you see echoes of this in Rav Kook's writings of the secular Zionists working together with the religious. I'm not sure if he was influenced directly from Achad Ha'am, but it's possible. But you do see some hints to that in his writings. So there is some sort of ultimate balance. Maybe we have yet to see that ultimate balance come to be. We'll hold it over here. Everyone, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And we'll continue next week with the final part.